Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1: The Marionette's Lament. The theater was dying, as was everything within its decaying walls. The wood of the stage had begun to warp. The velvet curtains had faded to a sickly shade of purple, and the seats were worn, their once gilded edges dulled by years of neglect. Dust clung to the rafters, suspended in the dim, grimy light that barely filtered through the broken windows. The very air of the place seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten years, the ghosts of former grandeur lingering like stale perfume. Edwin Gray, a puppeteer of modest skill and even more modest fame, looked out over the barren auditorium. His hands shook slightly as he arranged the puppets on the stage, preparing for yet another performance that no one would attend. The theater had once been the heart of the city, its performances the talk of the town. But now the seats were empty. The patrons had long since turned to newer, more electrifying entertainments. The whispers of a dying art echoed through the hall, each day a reminder that his craft, his passion, was being swallowed by time. Tonight, however, something was different. Something had changed in the air. Perhaps it was the storm that raged outside, shaking the windows of the theater with every gust of wind. Or perhaps it was the desperate hope that clung to Edwin like a second skin, the hope that with one final performance, he could revive the theater and reclaim his once promising career. He had been searching for something new, something that could reignite the fire of the audience, something that could make them remember the magic of the Marionette. And it was on this fateful night, as he wandered through the crumbling theater, that he stumbled upon it. In the attic, among the forgotten trunks and dusty props, was a single exquisite marionette. It was unlike any puppet Edwin had ever seen. Its face was carved from ivory, delicate and hauntingly beautiful. The body was slender and proportionate, dressed in finely crafted clothes of deep crimson and gold. The strings that suspended it were as thin as spider silk, yet seemed to shimmer with an unnatural gleam in the dim light. The craftsmanship was impeccable, and something about the marionette's eyes, dark and knowing, stirred a strange feeling within Edwin. For a moment, he simply stared at the puppet, transfixed. There was something undeniably alive in it, something that pulled at him, beckoning him to reach out. And so he did. That evening, as the theater slowly filled with the few loyal patrons who remained, Edwin prepared for the performance. The air was thick with tension, and his hands were clammy with nervous anticipation. He had carefully set the marionette in place, positioning it at the center of the stage where it could be admired in all its glory. The lights dimmed, and the show began. At first, everything seemed normal. The audience watched with faint curiosity as Edwin manipulated his other puppets, telling the same tired stories they had seen many times before. But when the marionette took the stage, something changed. The puppet moved with a grace and fluidity that no wooden figure had ever possessed. It danced, its limbs swaying with a lifelike elegance that seemed to defy the very nature of its inanimate existence. The audience, stunned into silence, watched with rapt attention, unable to tear their eyes away. Edwin's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when his art would be reborn. He worked the strings with deft precision, but there was something strange happening. As the marionette twirled and spun, Edwin felt a pull in his own hands, as though the strings were not only under his control, but had a mind of their own. The performance ended, but the crowd did not rise to leave. They sat motionless, staring at the stage, their faces pale and drawn. Edwin could feel their eyes upon him, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like a suffocating cloud. He bowed, but there was no applause. A chill ran down his spine. As the days passed, Edwin's fame grew. People began to speak of the new marionette, the one with the uncanny movements and lifelike grace. Audiences flocked to the theater, and the once forgotten theater came alive again, its crumbling walls echoing with laughter and applause. But with the growing success came an unsettling sensation. Edwin could not ignore the strange whispers that seemed to emanate from the marionette. At night, when the theater was empty and silent, he would hear them, soft, almost imperceptible, like a child's voice crying out in the darkness. The sound sent a shiver down his spine, but when he turned to check, there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder as the marionette's fame increased. At times, Edwin could swear he felt the puppet's eyes on him, watching him, judging him. The strings, once so delicate and easy to control, now seemed to tighten in his hands, as if they were pulling him towards something he could not understand. One night, after the final performance, Edwin stayed behind, alone in the theater. The marionette sat on its pedestal, its eyes fixed upon him. He walked toward it, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he reached out to touch the puppet, he felt an overwhelming force, like an invisible hand gripping his chest, tightening, squeezing. The whispers in the air grew louder, clearer. It was no longer a child's sobbing voice. It was a full, anguished wail, a cry of pain and despair. Edwin staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to pull away, but the strings of the marionette tightened around his fingers, binding him to it. A cold, wet sensation slid up his arm, and he looked down to see the strings slowly winding themselves around his wrist, tightening with every movement. The puppet's head tilted as if it were watching him, studying him with a knowing gaze. And then, in a voice that was not his own, Edwin spoke. "Release me," he whispered, but the words were not his. No, they came from the marionette itself, and they carried with them an unmistakable weight, as though the puppet was not simply alive, but aware of its own existence and its power. Edwin struggled against the strings, his heart pounding in his chest as the puppet's grip on him tightened. His fingers trembled, but no matter how hard he tugged, the threads only constricted more, as though they were made of iron instead of delicate silk. The marionette's eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, gleamed with an eerie intelligence. Edwin could feel its presence, its power, growing stronger with every passing moment. The theater around him seemed to darken, the walls closing in, as if the very structure of the building had become a living, breathing entity. The whispers swelled to a crescendo, no longer faint, but now a full-blown cacophony of voices, each one crying, begging, pleading. He could hear the distinct sobs of a child, the wails of agony, and then, beneath it all, a deeper, more sinister voice, one that seemed to come from the very core of the puppet itself. "You have taken what was never yours," it seemed to say. "Now you will pay the price." Edwin's pulse raced. The words felt like a curse, heavy and suffocating, hanging in the air around him like a storm cloud. He opened his mouth to cry out, but his voice was caught in his throat. The strings that bound him to the puppet were tightening with an insidious will, pulling him closer to the center of the stage, closer to the marionette. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The audience that had once filled the seats was now a distant memory, the laughter and applause replaced by the unsettling silence of the empty theater. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being judged, remained, and it was as if the very walls themselves had become spectators, silent witnesses to Edwin's slow unraveling. "You freed me," the marionette's voice echoed again, this time louder, more distinct. "Now you will join me." Edwin's breath caught in his throat as he was drawn closer to the puppet. His body refused to obey him, his movements stiff and controlled by the strings, as though he were merely an extension of the marionette itself. The room seemed to shift and warp around him, the shadows growing long and twisted, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of the puppet's influence. With each step closer to the marionette, Edwin felt his own identity slipping away, his own will being drowned beneath the torrent of dark forces that had been awakened. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they felt as though they were inside his mind, scratching at the edges of his sanity. What are you?" Edwin gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The marionette's head tilted to one side, its eyes never leaving his. A cold smile played at the corners of its carved lips, a smile that was both innocent and sinister, childlike and yet ancient in its malice. "I am what you have made me," it replied, its voice both mocking and sorrowful. "I was once alive, a child like any other, but they took me. They took my life, my soul, my body, and bound me to this form. And now you too will be trapped." Edwin's eyes widened with horror. He had never thought of it in those terms, never once questioned where the puppet had come from or why it moved with such an unnatural grace. But now it was clear. The marionette was not just an object of art. It was a vessel, a prison for a lost soul, one that had been robbed of its life and had been bound to the puppet for eternity. "How long?" Edwin whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "How long have you been trapped in this thing?" The marionette's smile faded, its eyes becoming cold and distant, as if recalling a time long forgotten. "Longer than you can imagine," it murmured. "I have been waiting for someone like you, waiting for someone to free me, but now that you have, you will never leave." Edwin recoiled in horror. He tried to pull away, but the strings were now completely out of his control. They coiled around his arms, his legs, tightening with each desperate movement, until his limbs were completely immobilized. His body was no longer his own, and the more he struggled, the more he realized the puppet's power was not merely in its movements, it was in him, inside him, twisting his very soul. "No," Edwin gasped, his voice cracking with terror. "I didn't mean it. I didn't know, please." But the marionette remained silent, its expression unreadable. The room was now cloaked in shadow, the faint flicker of the stage lights casting long, haunting silhouettes against the walls. It was as though the theater itself had become a prison, the walls closing in around him, trapping him in the darkness. And then, with a final deliberate motion, the marionette's mouth opened, and Edwin felt a surge of cold wash over him. It was as though something was being drawn out of him, something he could not understand, a life force, a piece of his very being. He felt his vision blur, his body growing weaker, as though the puppet was draining the life from him, one string at a time. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the shadows. When the storm finally passed, and dawn's pale light filtered through the cracks in the theater's broken windows, the marionette was still there, standing at the center of the stage. The empty theater was silent, save for the faint creaking of the old wood and the soft rustling of the curtains. Edwin Gray was never seen again. Some say he was claimed by the Marionette, his body consumed by the strings that once controlled the puppet. Others claim he simply vanished, his soul trapped within the theater, bound by the same fate that had befallen the puppet. But one thing remained certain. The marionette still danced, still performed its macabre ballet under the flickering lights, its strings never still, its movements always unnaturally graceful. And every now and then, when the wind howls through the empty streets and the shadows grow long, some say they hear the faint sobs of a child, crying out in the darkness. Story 2, The Basement Room. The house on Maplewood Street was everything the Jenkins family had dreamed of. A charming two-story house with a white picket fence, nestled at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Wainwrights, had lived there for decades before finally deciding to sell. They assured the Jenkins family that the house had been well maintained and that everything was in perfect order. But there was one thing they never mentioned: a locked door in the basement. The Jenkins family moved in during the first days of autumn. The air was crisp, the leaves turning shades of gold and amber, and the promise of new beginnings filled the house. The mother, Evelyn, was thrilled by the spacious kitchen and large backyard, while her husband, Charles, appreciated the study where he could work from home. Their two children, Claire, a teenager, and the youngest, Ethan, an inquisitive 9-year-old, were already making plans to explore the woods nearby. They settled in quickly, though there was always an undercurrent of unease that the family couldn't quite shake. The basement, for one, was strange. It was a room far deeper and darker than they had expected, with stone walls that were old and cold to the touch. The door to the basement room was solid, reinforced with iron, and locked with an old-fashioned key. No one seemed to know where the key was, but the Wainwrights had reassured them that it was nothing to worry about. "The basement's just an old storage area," Mrs. Wainwright had said, her voice brittle with age. "You can use it for whatever you like, but that room, well, we've kept it locked for a long time. Just some old things in there, nothing important." Yet something about the door gnawed at the back of Ethan's mind. The curious key. It started innocently enough, as it always did. Ethan was in the basement one afternoon, organizing some of the boxes they'd brought from their old house. He had a tendency to explore places others overlooked, and the basement seemed like the perfect place to get away from his sister's teasing and his parents' constant chatter. While sifting through the dusty boxes and old furniture, he noticed something peculiar: a small brass key resting among a pile of old newspaper clippings. At first, Ethan thought nothing of it, but then something inside him clicked. He knew the key was important. His heart raced as he wondered what it could open. The door to the basement room, perhaps? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ethan crept down to the basement with the key clenched tightly in his hand. His footsteps were silent on the cold concrete floor as he approached the locked door. It stood at the far end of the basement, framed by the dim light from the single bulb above. Ethan's fingers trembled as he slid the key into the lock. The metal turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. The dark room. The room beyond the door was more than just an old storage area. It was a cavernous space that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with old, rotting wooden shelves filled with boxes, broken furniture, and items that appeared to have been forgotten for decades. There was no light save for the faintest glimmer from the basement bulb above, which only illuminated the edges of the room, leaving the center in pitch-black shadow. Ethan stepped inside, his breath hitching in his chest as the temperature seemed to drop around him. The air was thick with dust, and the silence felt oppressive, as though the room itself was holding its breath. He turned to leave, but stopped when he saw it, the large wooden chest in the far corner. It was unlike anything else in the room. Unlike the rest of the furniture, this chest was intact, its surface polished and gleaming, as though it had been well cared for. Curiosity overtook him. Ethan crossed the room and knelt in front of the chest, hesitating for a moment before he reached for the latch. The wood creaked as he lifted the lid, revealing a pile of old, faded blankets. But there was something else, something moving beneath the blankets. Ethan recoiled in shock, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it again, a shadow, shifting, slithering out from under the blankets. Before he could react, a cold, clammy hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed him by the wrist. The things that crawl, Ethan screamed, but the sound was muffled as the hand pulled him deeper into the darkness. He struggled, his breath quick and shallow as he tried to break free, but the grip tightened. The room seemed to come alive, the shadows shifting and swirling as if the very walls were moving toward him. From the darkness, he could hear whispers, low, guttural murmurs that sounded almost like words. The air around him seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and he felt as though the very ground beneath him was alive. With a desperate burst of strength, Ethan managed to break free from the grip, stumbling backward toward the door. His feet slipped on the cold floor, and he barely managed to keep his balance. He didn't look back as he ran toward the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut behind him, the house felt strangely still. He didn't dare open the door again. The warnings begin. The next few days were strange. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out of the basement. At night, he could hear whispers, low, scraping sounds from the walls, as though something was trying to get in. And the shadows in the corners of his room seemed to grow longer, as if they were reaching out for him. The strangest thing, though, was the smell. It wasn't quite rotten, but it was thick and musty, like the air in the basement. It clung to everything, from his clothes to his hair, and even the food on the dinner table. Ethan tried to tell his parents, but they didn't believe him. They dismissed his fears as childish imagination. But Claire, his older sister, had noticed something too. She had seen the strange marks on the walls of the basement, marks that weren't there before. They looked like deep scratches, as though something had clawed its way out. "I don't like it down there," Claire said one evening, her voice shaking. "There's something wrong with that room. Rod, I think we need to get out of this house." Ethan couldn't agree more. He began to fear the dark corners of the house, the places that seemed to be watching him. The things he had seen in the basement were still there, just beyond the edges of his vision. At night, the sounds grew louder. The whispers became more distinct, turning into pleas for help, for release. Ethan knew they were coming. The final hour. One night, when the house was bathed in an eerie moonlight, the basement door swung open by itself. Ethan froze in his room, his heart racing. The whispers had become screams. He couldn't stop himself. He had to see what was down there. He had to understand what was calling to him. When he reached the basement, the door was wide open. The room was darker than it had ever been, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his pulse pounding in his ears. The chest was gone, and in its place was something far worse. Something that crawled, something that was hungry. It had taken shape, its body twisted and malformed, an amalgamation of shadow and sinew. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with rows of sharp teeth. The creature let out a low growl, and Ethan knew, without a doubt, that it was coming for him. He turned and ran, but the things in the shadows were already closing in. The house on Maplewood Street was never the same after that night. The Jenkins family disappeared without a trace, their belongings left behind, and the basement room locked once again. The whispers still echo through the walls of the house, and the things that crawl in the darkness are still hungry. Story 3. The Silent Neighbor. Amelia and Robert had just moved into the old apartment building, eager for a fresh start. They had spent months searching for a place that was both affordable and close to Robert's new job, and when they found the aging but charming building tucked away on a quiet street, it seemed perfect. The floors creaked underfoot, the walls were a little thin, and the hallway had an air of neglect, but it was cozy enough, and the price was right. At first, they didn't think much of the elderly man who lived next door. His name was Mr. Hargrave, or so the landlord had told them. He was quiet, too quiet in fact. The couple had moved in 2 weeks ago, and they hadn't once heard him speak, nor had they ever seen him leave his apartment. "He's probably just a private person," Robert had said when Amelia mentioned it one night after dinner. But as the days went by, the silence became unsettling. There was no noise at all coming from Mr. Hargrave's apartment. No television, no footsteps, not even the sound of him getting up for a drink of water. It was as if the apartment next door was completely abandoned. Amelia's curiosity got the better of her. She knocked on his door one evening, but there was no answer. She tried again the next day, and still nothing. It seemed strange for someone to be so elusive, especially in such a tight-knit, aging building. After several attempts, she gave up, deciding to focus on other matters. Still, she couldn't help but wonder about the man who never seemed to make a sound. It wasn't long after that things began to happen. The first strange incident was small, but it was enough to set Amelia on edge. One night, as she and Robert were settling in for bed, they heard the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth just outside their door. Amelia froze, holding her breath. Robert, half asleep, groaned, but Amelia's heart began to race. She waited for the sound to fade, but it didn't. The footsteps continued, like someone was trying to make their way to their door, but never quite reaching it. After several long minutes, the sound stopped suddenly. Amelia looked at Robert, who hadn't heard a thing. "That's strange," she whispered, getting out of bed to check. She opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. Only the faintest creaking of the building's old frame filled the air. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Every time, the footsteps would begin at some point during the night and last for what felt like an eternity, always in the hallway outside their door. Sometimes they'd stop abruptly, as if someone had abruptly turned and walked away. But there was never anyone there when Amelia checked, Then one evening, a new sound emerged. Whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift through the walls and seep into their apartment. Amelia couldn't make out the words, but they sounded like low, distant voices echoing through the building's aging pipes. At first, she thought it was just her imagination or the wind carrying strange sounds through the walls. But the whispers grew clearer and more frequent until they were impossible to ignore. One night, unable to take it any longer, Amelia sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to be coming from the apartment next door. The walls, though thick, could never completely block the sounds. They were close now, urgent, as though someone or something was speaking just on the other side of the wall. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. She leaned closer to the wall, pressing her ear against it. The voices were clearer now, and she could make out a few words. Help, escape, not alone. Her heart skipped a beat. She pulled away from the wall, suddenly feeling trapped in her own apartment. What was going on? Why was Mr. Hargrave's apartment making these strange noises? And why hadn't anyone else mentioned it? Surely, someone else had to have heard it. But when she looked over at Robert, he was fast asleep, unaware of the growing unease that gnawed at her. She tried to calm herself and forced herself to sleep, but the whispers followed her into her dreams. The next morning, things took a darker turn. Amelia had just finished making breakfast when she heard a soft scratching noise coming from behind the walls. She froze, listening intently. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was something deliberate about it, like nails dragging slowly across the plaster. The sound was coming from the shared wall between their apartment and Mr. Hargrave's. Robert, still half asleep and groggy, rubbed his eyes. "Amelia, what is that?" he asked, clearly disturbed by the odd sound. But before she could respond, the scratching stopped. "That's it. I'm talking to him," Amelia said, determination rising in her chest. She had to know what was happening in the apartment next door. When she knocked on Mr. Hargrave's door again that afternoon, the sound of movement from inside startled her. It was the first time she'd heard anything from his apartment in weeks. She knocked again, more forcefully this time, but still there was no answer. Just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open, revealing a pale, gaunt figure standing in the shadows. Mr. Hargrave was not what she had expected. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He seemed distant, like a man lost in a dream or trapped in some terrible memory. "Yes?" he asked, his voice raspy and distant. Amelia faltered. "I've been hearing strange noises from your apartment, whispers and footsteps at night. Are you all right?" Mr. Hargrave stared at her for a long moment before speaking again. "There's no one here," he said softly, his eyes darting around as though he feared someone was watching. "It's just me." Something about his response sent a cold shiver down her spine. His apartment looked dark, empty, and lifeless, with no lights on and the air thick with dust. There was no sign of life within, no indication that anyone else was present. "I haven't heard anything," he continued, his voice lower now, almost too quiet to hear. "But you're not the first one to ask." Amelia's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mr. Hargrave whispered, "that there have been others, people who've asked questions, people who've heard things, but they never stayed long enough to find out what's really here." He paused, his eyes widening, his voice now almost a breath. "I'm not alone. Not anymore." Before Amelia could respond, the door slammed shut in her face. That night, the whispers returned, this time louder and clearer than ever. But now, Amelia wasn't the only one who could hear them. Robert woke up to the sound as well, sitting up in a panic. "What is that?" he whispered, his face pale with fear. Amelia's heart raced. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew they weren't alone in the building. Mr. Hargrave wasn't just hiding from the world. He was hiding from whatever else lurked in the shadows of that old apartment. As the night stretched on, the whispers grew louder until they were no longer whispers at all. They were screams, agonized cries that pierced the silence of the apartment, followed by the unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps. Robert grabbed Amelia's hand, his grip tight and trembling. "I think it's time we leave," he said, his voice breaking. But as they reached for the door, the hallway outside their apartment filled with shadow, and the footsteps began once more, this time coming from all directions. The couple froze. They were not alone.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.